The massive space station hung in the darkness like a glittering city. It orbited the planet Kepler 442b, a world that belonged to no one and served as neutral ground for the Galactic Council. Inside the station's Great Hall, 7 different alien species gathered around a circular table that could have held a small aircraft. Commander Thexvar of the Vorthak clicked his massive claws against the metal surface. His body looked like a giant beetle covered in natural armor plating. Each piece of his shell could stop a plasma rifle blast. His people had conquered 12 star systems through pure military might. The idea of weakness disgusted him. So these humans want to join our council, Thexvar said, his voice like grinding stone. Let us see what they offer. The holographic display activated above the table. Images of Earth began to play. The other council members leaned forward to watch. There was Crystalline of the Selenites, her body made of living crystal that could survive in the heart of a star. Zephwing of the Zephyrian spread his metallic wings, each feather sharp enough to cut through steel. The energy being called Luxanova floated nearby, its form shifting between different colors of light. The first images showed human cities. They looked impressive enough, with tall buildings and flying vehicles. But then the display changed to show human military forces. The aliens began to snicker. Look at them, Thexvar rumbled. They wear artificial armor because their skin is soft. They carry weapons because their claws are weak. They ride in vehicles because their legs are slow. The display showed human soldiers in combat. The aliens watched as the humans took cover, behind walls and barriers. They saw medics rushing to help wounded fighters. They observed humans retreating when outnumbered. Crystalline's crystal body chimed like breaking glass when she laughed. My people walk through lava flows for recreation. These humans cannot even stand in their own sunlight without covering their skin. The video showed human space exploration. The aliens saw humans wearing bulky environmental suits, breathing artificial air, and requiring complex life support systems just to survive in the vacuum of space. Pathetic, hissed Sistera of the Reptani. Her scales shifted color from green to red, showing her contempt. My species can survive in space for hours using only our natural abilities. These humans die in minutes without their machines. Zephwing folded his metallic wings. We soar through the upper atmospheres of gas giants. These humans struggle to fly in their own thin air. The display continued showing human weaknesses. Medical facilities full of injured humans. Psychological treatment centers for humans suffering from stress and fear. Even their children required constant care and supervision to survive. They live such short lives, observed Elder Menthkai of the Eternals, his ancient voice echoing through the chamber. We measure our existence in millennia. They barely manage a single century. Luxanova's energy form pulsed with amusement. And they require sleep. Every single day they become unconscious and helpless for hours. Any predator could eliminate them. The presentation reached its conclusion. The council members sat in silence for a moment, then began to discuss among themselves. Surely this is some kind of joke, Thexvar said. No species this weak could have developed space travel. Perhaps they had help, suggested Crystalline. Some more advanced species might have given them technology. The human representative stepped forward from where he had been waiting at the edge of the Great Hall. His name was Jake Morrison, and he looked exactly like what the aliens expected from the videos. He was neither large nor impressive. His skin was pale and soft-looking. He wore simple clothing that would provide no protection in battle. When he spoke, his voice was quiet compared to the booming tones of the alien council members. Honored Council, Jake said. Humanity requests the privilege of joining your alliance. We believe we can contribute to the peace and prosperity of the galaxy. Thexavar's mandibles clicked together in what passed for laughter among his people. Contribute? What could your species possibly offer? You cannot fight. You cannot survive in harsh environments. You require constant care and feeding like infants. We offer our unique perspective and abilities, Jake replied calmly. Abilities? Sistara's scales rippled with colors of mockery. We have seen your abilities. You break easily, you fear pain, you die from diseases that would not even slow down our children. The other council members joined in the criticism. They pointed out how humans needed tools for everything, how they suffered from emotional problems, how they fought among themselves constantly. Each alien species compared their own natural advantages to human limitations. Your people are warriors, but weak warriors, Thexvar concluded. Your soldiers hide behind walls and call for help when injured. My people charge into battle with joy, knowing our shells will protect us. Your people are explorers, but timid explorers, added Zephwing. You fear the open sky and empty space. My people dance among the stars without artificial protection. Jake listened to all their criticisms without interrupting. His face showed no anger or embarrassment. This puzzled some of the aliens who expected him to either argue or flee in shame. Finally, Elder Menthkai spoke. Young human, your species clearly lacks the strength necessary for membership in our council. However, we are not entirely without mercy. The ancient being paused, considering his words carefully. We will offer you a test, a single opportunity to prove that humanity deserves a place among the galactic community. If you succeed, we will grant you full membership. If you fail, your people will remain isolated on your small world. Jake straightened slightly. What kind of test? Thexvar's claws drummed against the table. A diplomatic mission. There is a world called Zerion 7, where two factions of the native species have been fighting for 50 years. Previous peace missions have all failed. The Vorthak tried to force them to stop fighting. The Selenites tried to convince them with logic. The Zephyrians tried to overawe them with superior technology. Nothing has worked. You want us to negotiate peace where others have failed? Jake asked. Exactly. Crystalline chimed. Send your finest diplomats, your most skilled negotiators. Let us see if human weakness can accomplish what alien strength could not. The way she said diplomats made it sound like an insult. The other council members clearly expected the humans to fail quickly and embarrassingly. We accept the challenge, Jake said without hesitation. This surprised several of the aliens. They had expected the human to ask for time to consult with his government or to request easier terms. You accept immediately? Sethera asked. Without knowing the full details of the conflict, we accept, Jake repeated. When do we leave? Thexvar's massive head tilted in curiosity. You show no fear of this impossible task. Perhaps humans are even more foolish than we thought. Perhaps, Jake agreed. Or perhaps you do not understand what human diplomats really are. He turned to address the full council. We will send our team to Zerion 7. When we succeed, we ask only that you remember this moment. Remember how certain you were that we would fail. The aliens exchanged glances. The humans' confidence seemed either admirable or insane. Most of them leaned toward insane. Very well, Elder Menthkai declared. You have one standard galactic year to achieve peace on Zerion 7. Transport will be provided. Beyond that, you are on your own. Jake bowed slightly to the council. Thank you for this opportunity. You will not regret it. As he walked away from the Great Hall, the alien voices rose behind him in discussion. They were already placing bets on how quickly the human mission would collapse. Some gave it a few days. Others were more generous and predicted it might last a few weeks. None of them suspected that they were about to learn the difference between strength and power, between force and influence, between conquering and convincing. They were about to discover what human diplomats really were, and why the galaxy's most dangerous conflicts required the most fragile species to solve them. The transport ship dropped out of hyperspace near Zerion 7, and Jake Morrison got his first look at the planet that would either make or break humanity's future in the galaxy. Through the viewport, he saw a world of extremes. One side blazed, under the light of a massive red sun, turning the surface into a furnace of cracked rock and burning sand. The other side lay in permanent darkness, frozen and lifeless under a blanket of stars. Cheerful place, muttered Lieutenant Commander Lisa Parker, checking her equipment for the third time. She was a former Navy intelligence officer with sharp eyes and an even sharper mind. Her specialty was reading people and situations, skills that had served her well in her previous career. Major Ben Carter studied the planetary data on his tablet. The Army Special Forces veteran had seen plenty of hostile environments, but Zerion 7 looked worse than most. Temperature ranges from 200 degrees on the day side to -100 on the night side. Atmosphere is breathable but thin. No surface water except for underground rivers. Dr. Amy Sullivan looked pale as she reviewed the medical data. The civilian anthropologist had spent years studying conflict resolution, but this was her first mission to an actual war zone. The briefing materials say both sides have been fighting for 50 years. That means children born into this conflict have never known peace. Staff Sergeant Tony Rodriguez finished loading their supplies. The Marine Corps logistics expert had packed everything with military precision, but even he worried it might not be enough. We got food for 60 days, water for 30, and enough medical supplies to treat a small army. Hope it's enough. Jake nodded to his team. They were good people, each chosen for specific skills that Earth's diplomatic corps believed would be essential. What the Galactic Council did not know was that Earth's diplomats were not the smooth-talking politicians that other species might expect. They were soldiers, scholars, and survivors who had learned to solve problems in the hardest possible ways. The transport ship entered the planet's atmosphere, heading for the twilight zone between the burning day side and the frozen night side. This narrow strip of tolerable temperature was where both factions of the Zerathi species maintained their settlements. The Zerathi were humanoid reptiles who had evolved to survive in their world's harsh conditions. The sunward Zerathi lived, on the day side, developing thick scales that reflected heat and light. They were aggressive and territorial, believing that strength and dominance were the only paths to survival. The shadow side Zerathi had adapted to the dark side, becoming pale and sensitive, with large eyes and enhanced hearing. They made decisions as a group and valued cooperation over individual achievement. The conflict had started over water rights. The planet's only major underground river system ran beneath the twilight zone, and both factions needed access to survive. What began as a dispute over territory had grown into a full war involving raids, sabotage, and revenge killings that had lasted 2 generations. The human team landed at a neutral site that previous diplomatic missions had established. It was little more than a cleared area with some prefabricated shelters and a communications array. The buildings showed signs of damage from sandstorms and occasional attacks. "Welcome to paradise," Ben said, stepping out of the shuttle into air that felt like breathing soup. Even in the twilight zone, the heat was oppressive, and the thin atmosphere made every breath an effort. Lisa wiped sweat from her forehead and looked around at the barren landscape. The Vorthak tried to intimidate both sides into surrendering. When that failed, they bombed a few military targets and left. Amy consulted her notes. The Selenites attempted to negotiate a logical resource-sharing agreement. They couldn't understand why the Zerathi kept arguing about emotional and cultural issues instead of accepting their mathematical solution. Tony began setting up their base camp with practiced efficiency. The Zephyrians flew reconnaissance missions for 3 months, mapping every inch of the surface. They never figured out that the real action was happening underground. Jake studied the horizon, where he could see smoke rising from distant settlements. Even now, raids and counter-raids continued between the two factions. And the Kyrene energy beings tried to solve the problem by offering to relocate both groups to other planets. They didn't grasp that the Zerathi consider this their ancestral home. Within hours of their arrival, representatives from both factions appeared at the neutral zone. They came separately, of course, refusing to meet at the same time. Solark Vextor of the Sunward Zerathi arrived first, accompanied by a squad of warriors whose scales gleamed like mirrors in the harsh light. He was tall and broad, with scars covering his arms and face. His voice was deep and commanding. "More weak aliens come to waste our time," he declared, looking at the humans with obvious contempt. "You are even more pathetic than the others. At least the Vorthak looked like warriors, even if they fought like cowards." Jake stepped forward calmly. "We are here to help end this conflict." "Help?" Vextor laughed, a harsh sound like breaking glass. You cannot even survive on our world without your machines and shelters. How can you help warriors who have fought for generations? The Solark gestured at the human team. Amy was already suffering. From the heat and altitude, her face flushed and breathing labored. Ben was drinking water constantly to avoid dehydration. Lisa had to wear protective eyewear to shield her eyes from the glare. Tony was struggling to set up equipment that kept malfunctioning in the harsh conditions. Your people are weak, Vexter continued. Weak in body, weak in spirit. The Sunward Zarathi respect only strength. We have no use for your words or your treaties. He turned to leave, then paused. But we will not attack you while you are here. Even we do not make war on children and invalids. After the Sunward delegation left, the Shadowside representatives arrived. Shadow Speaker Nilwen was smaller and more delicate than Vextor, with pale scales and large dark eyes. She moved quietly, accompanied by a group of advisors who whispered among themselves in their own language. We greet you, strangers from beyond our world, Nilwen said, her voice soft but carrying clearly in the thin air. Though we wonder why you have come to a place of such sorrow and pain. We hope to bring peace, Jake replied. Nilwen's advisors murmured among themselves before she spoke again. Peace is a beautiful dream, but dreams do not survive in the harsh light of reality. Your people seem kind, but kindness alone cannot heal wounds that have festered for 50 years. She observed the human team with careful attention. Amy was sitting in the shade, still recovering from heat exhaustion. Ben was methodically checking and rechecking their equipment, clearly frustrated by the repeated malfunctions. Lisa was taking notes on everything, but her hand shook slightly from exhaustion. Tony was rationing their water supplies with obvious concern. The other aliens who came before you were strong in their own ways, Nilwen said. But they could not understand our pain because they had never known true suffering. You, however, suffer even now just by being here. Perhaps that means you can understand what we have endured. After both delegations left, the human team gathered in their main shelter. The prefabricated building provided some relief from the heat, but the thin atmosphere and harsh conditions were taking their toll on everyone. Well, that went about as expected, Lisa said, reviewing her notes. The Sunward Zarathi respect only strength, which they don't think we have. The Shadowside Zarathi value understanding, but they don't believe we can truly comprehend their situation. Amy sipped water slowly, still pale from her earlier bout with the heat. Both sides see us as outsiders who can't possibly relate to their problems. The previous diplomatic missions failed because they tried to impose solutions from the outside. Ben was cleaning sand out of their equipment for the 4th time that day. The environment here is actively hostile. Our gear is failing, our water supplies are limited, and we're all showing signs of heat stress. Maybe the aliens were right about us being too weak for this job. Tony looked up from his supply inventory. We got enough food and water for maybe 40 days if we're careful. After that, we either succeed or we're in serious trouble. Jake listened to his team's concerns without interruption. He could see the doubt in their eyes, the growing realization of just how difficult their mission would be. The Galactic Council had given them an impossible task, and they were starting to understand why every previous diplomatic mission had failed. But Jake also saw something else in his team. Despite their exhaustion and discomfort, they were still working. Despite their equipment failures and limited supplies, they were still planning. Despite the hostility from both Zarathi factions, they were still trying to find a way forward. The other species failed because they tried to use their strengths, Jake said finally. The Vorthak used force. The Selenites used logic. The Zephyrians used technology. The Kyrene used their ability to exist anywhere. But none of them used what we have. What do we have? Amy asked. Jake looked at each member of his team. We have the ability to suffer alongside the people we're trying to help. We have the experience of being vulnerable and needing others to survive. We have the knowledge that comes from being weak in a hostile universe. The first week on Zirion 7 nearly broke the human team. The Galactic Council monitored their progress through long-range sensors, and the alien observers were not impressed by what they saw. Commander Thexvar watched the daily reports with growing satisfaction. The humans were clearly suffering. Their equipment continued to malfunction in the harsh environment. Dr. Amy Sullivan had collapsed twice more from heat exhaustion and was spending most of her time resting in whatever shade they could find. Major Ben Carter was losing weight rapidly as his body struggled to adapt to the thin atmosphere and extreme temperatures. "Look at them," Thexavar rumbled to his fellow council members during their weekly review session. 3 of their 5 team members are already compromised. The female scientist can barely stand upright. The soldier appears to be wasting away. Even their leader shows obvious signs of stress and fatigue. Crystalline's crystal body chimed with amusement. "My people could have solved this conflict in days using simple logical pressure. These humans cannot even solve the problem of keeping themselves healthy." But something strange was happening on Xerion 7 that the council members did not fully understand. The very weaknesses that made the aliens mock the human team were starting to have an unexpected effect on the Zerathi. It began when Amy collapsed during a meeting with a group of Shadowside Zerathi elders. Instead of ending the session and retreating to their shelter, the human team continued the discussion while caring for their fallen colleague. Lisa Parker knelt beside Amy, checking her pulse and temperature while Jake Morrison kept talking to the Zerathi about water distribution issues. The Shadowside elders had never seen anything like it. In their culture, the group always cared for individuals in need, but they had never witnessed aliens doing the same thing. Most species they had encountered either abandoned their weak members or showed them as signs of failure. "Your companion is injured," observed Elder Simtha, an ancient Shadowside female whose pale scales had turned almost white with age. "Should you not take her to safety?" "She would want us to continue," Jake replied, helping Lisa move Amy to a more comfortable position. "This work is too important to stop." Tony Rodriguez unpacked one of their precious medical kits and began treating Amy's dehydration with IV fluids. He worked with practiced efficiency, but his hands shook slightly from his own exhaustion. The idea Zerathi watched in fascination as the humans turned their attention between caring for their teammate and continuing the diplomatic discussion. "Among our people, we care for those who cannot care for themselves," Lisa explained as she monitored Amy's condition. "It makes us stronger as a group." Elder Simtha tilted her head in curiosity. "But caring for the weak requires resources that could be used by the strong. Does this not make your species less efficient?" Ben Carter looked up from the water purification equipment he was trying to repair. "Maybe in the short term, but in the long term, taking care of each other means we all survive better. Today Amy needs help. Tomorrow it might be me or Jake or any of us." This concept puzzled the Shadowside Zerathi. They cared for their community members, but they had never considered that weakness could become a source of strength. They began asking more questions about human society and how such a fragile species had managed to develop space travel. Meanwhile, on the sunward side of the conflict, a different kind of recognition was developing. Major Carter's persistence in mapping the underground water systems had impressed some of the younger sunward warriors. They watched him crawl through narrow cave passages day after day, despite being obviously exhausted and suffering from cuts and bruises that would heal slowly in the harsh environment. "The soft alien does not give up," observed warrior Kexalon, a young sunward fighter who had been assigned to monitor the human activities. "He is weak, but he continues when stronger beings would rest." Solarch Vextor dismissed such observations. "Stubbornness is not strength. He continues because he is too stupid to know when he is defeated." But Kexalon was not convinced. He had watched Carter work for days with bleeding hands and aching muscles, never complaining or asking for help. The human's endurance was different from Zerathi toughness, but it was impressive in its own way. The breakthrough came when Carter discovered something that previous alien reconnaissance missions had missed. Deep in the cave system, he found evidence of a much larger underground water source than anyone had suspected. The discovery came at a cost. He emerged from the caves barely conscious, dehydrated and injured from a fall in the darkness. Tony Rodriguez and Jake Morrison carried Carter back to their shelter while Lisa tried to raise Dr. Sullivan, who was still recovering from her own heat-related illness. The sight of 3 humans struggling to help their injured teammate while maintaining their mission objectives made an impression on both Zerathi factions. They do not abandon their wounded, Warrior Kexlon reported to Solark Vextor, even when it would be easier to leave him behind. Foolish sentiment, Vextor replied, but his voice lacked its usual conviction. The real change began when Amy Sullivan, despite her own weakness, started providing medical assistance to injured Zerathi from both factions. Her collapse during the meeting with the Shadowside elders had been caused partly by her insistence on treating a young Zerathi who had been wounded in a recent raid. At first, both sides were suspicious of her medical knowledge. The Sunward Zerathi wondered if she was trying to poison their warriors. The Shadowside Zerathi worried that accepting help from aliens would make them appear weak to their enemies. But Amy's genuine concern for the welfare of both groups gradually won their trust. When a Sunward warrior was badly injured in a cave-in while trying to access a water source, Amy worked for hours to stabilize his condition despite her own exhaustion. When a group of Shadowside children became sick from contaminated water, she shared the humans' limited medical supplies to treat them. She helps our enemies as well as our allies, Shadow Speaker Nilwyn observed during one of the regular diplomatic sessions. This seems unwise from a strategic perspective. Amy looked up from the medical report she was reviewing. Sick and injured people are not enemies. They are just people who need help. This simple statement confused both Zerathi factions. In their world of constant conflict, the idea of treating opponents with the same care as friends seemed impossible to understand. Tony Rodriguez's obsession with basic survival needs was also having an unexpected effect. While the previous alien diplomatic missions had focused on political solutions and abstract agreements, Tony was documenting exactly how much water each settlement needed, how food was distributed, and where people were most vulnerable to environmental dangers. His detailed logistics reports revealed something that the warring factions had not fully realized. The conflict was not really about territory or honor or ancient grudges. It was about fear. Both sides were afraid that they would not have enough resources to survive, so they fought to control what they could. The underground river system can support both populations, Tony explained during a joint meeting that Jake had somehow convinced both sides to attend, but only if the distribution is managed properly and waste is eliminated. Solark Vextor's scales bristled with irritation. You think this is about water? This is about strength and weakness, dominance and submission. Maybe, Tony replied, his voice steady despite his obvious fatigue. But strong people who die of thirst are still dead, and weak people who have enough water can still survive. The Galactic Council continued to monitor these developments with growing puzzlement. The human team was clearly failing by any reasonable measure. They were sick, injured, and exhausted. Their equipment was breaking down. Their supplies were running low. Yet somehow they were achieving more contact with both Zerathi factions than any previous diplomatic mission. Perhaps they are too stupid to realize they should give up, suggested Sis Thara during one of the council's review sessions. But Elder Menthkai was beginning to suspect something else. Or perhaps they understand something about diplomacy that we do not. On Zerion 7, the human team was indeed learning something new about their mission. Their weakness was not a handicap to overcome. It was a tool for building connections. Every time they struggled, every time they needed help, every time they showed vulnerability, they demonstrated something that the Zerathi had forgotten in 50 years of war. They showed that it was possible to be weak and still be brave. They showed that asking for help was not the same as surrendering. They showed that caring for others, even enemies, was not foolishness but wisdom. Jake Morrison sat in their shelter late one evening, reviewing the day's progress while his team rested. Amy was finally recovering from her latest bout of heat, exhaustion. Ben was sleeping despite the pain from his injured ribs. Lisa was writing reports despite the headache that had plagued her for days. Tony was checking their dwindling supplies despite his own exhaustion. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new failures, new weaknesses to overcome. But for the first time since arriving on Zerion 7, Jake began to believe that their human frailties might be exactly what this broken world needed to heal. The sandstorm came without warning on the 32nd day of the mission. Jake Morrison was in the middle of a delicate negotiation session when the sky suddenly turned dark orange and the wind began to howl like a living thing. Within minutes, the air became so thick with sand that breathing required covering the mouth and nose with cloth. "Everyone to the caves," Jake shouted over the roaring wind. "Now!" The human team had established their main base camp near the entrance to the underground water system that Ben Carter had been mapping. It was the safest place during the frequent sandstorms that plagued the Twilight Zone. But this storm was different. It was bigger and more violent than anything they had experienced before. As the humans rushed toward the cave entrance, they discovered they were not alone. A group of Sunward Zarathi warriors had been caught in the open during a patrol. Their reflective scales, so effective against heat and light, provided no protection against the sandstorm. They stumbled through the blinding sand, clearly lost and in danger. At the same time, a delegation of Shadowside Zarathi, who had been returning from the negotiations, found themselves trapped between the storm and a section of unstable rock. There, sensitive eyes and pale skin made them especially vulnerable to the stinging sand. Without hesitation, Jake made a decision that would have seemed impossible weeks earlier. "Tony, guide the Sunward group to the caves. Lisa, help the shadow side." "Delegation, we bring everyone inside." "Both sides?" Lisa asked, having to shout to be heard over the wind. "Together?" "Both sides," Jake confirmed. Tony Rodriguez fought his way through the storm toward the confused Sunward warriors. His voice was barely audible as he called to them. "This way. Follow me to shelter." Warrior Kexlon recognized the human through the swirling sand. "Weak alien, save yourself. We can find our own way." "No, you cannot," Tony replied bluntly. "You are lost and the storm is getting worse. Follow me or die out here." There was something in the human's voice that cut through the Sunward warrior's pride. Maybe it was the complete lack of fear, or maybe it was the matter-of-fact way Tony stated the truth. Kexalon gestured to his warriors and they followed the small human toward the cave entrance. Meanwhile, Lisa Parker was helping the Shadowside delegation navigate around the dangerous rocks. Dr. Amy Sullivan, still weak from her recent illness, supported an elderly Shadowside elder who had fallen and injured his leg. "We are grateful for your assistance," Shadow Speaker Neilwyn said as they reached the cave entrance. "But we cannot shelter with the Sunward. It would violate 50 years of custom." "You can violate custom or you can die in the storm," Amy replied, breathing heavily from the effort of supporting the injured elder. "Your choice." The Shadowside delegation exchanged uncertain glances. They had never been in the same enclosed space as their enemies. But the storm was growing stronger, and the cave was the only safe refuge for miles. Inside the cave system, an unprecedented situation developed. For the first time in decades, members of both Zarathi factions found themselves in the same space, with nowhere else to go. The humans quickly established a safe area near the underground river, but the atmosphere was tense with decades of mutual hatred. Solark Vextor arrived with the main group of Sunward warriors just as the storm reached its peak intensity. He looked around the cave and saw his traditional enemies huddled nearby. His hand moved to his weapon. "Sunward do not hide with shadow crawlers," he declared, his voice echoing off the cave walls. "And Shadowside do not cower with sunburned brutes," replied Elder Simtha, despite her obvious fear. The situation could have exploded into violence, but something unexpected happened. Ben Carter, who had been resting near the back of the cave while recovering from his latest injuries, struggled to his feet and walked to the center of the group. "The storm will last 3 days, he announced, consulting his weather monitoring equipment. "Maybe longer. We have food for everyone for 2 days if we share equally. Water is not a problem since we are next to the river, but we need to work together or people will die." Vextor's scales bristled with anger. "Work with them? Never." "Then starve," Ben replied, his voice matter-of-fact. "I have mapped every inch of these caves. There is no other exit until the storm passes. We share resources or we all suffer." The human team began organizing the shelter as if the presence of 2 hostile armies was perfectly normal. Tony Rodriguez divided their remaining food supplies into equal portions for all the Zarathi, making no distinction between Sunward and Shadowside. Amy Sullivan set up a medical station near the river and announced that she would treat anyone who needed help, regardless of faction. "This is madness," muttered warrior Kexalon, but he accepted his portion of human food when Tony handed it to him. Lisa Parker began documenting the cave system's capacity and airflow, calculating how to keep everyone safe during the extended confinement. Jake Morrison simply found a central position and waited to see what would develop. The first day was marked by suspicious silence. The two factions stayed on opposite sides of the cave, glaring at each other across the space. The humans moved freely between both groups, treating them exactly the same. When a young Shadowside warrior developed breathing problems from inhaling too much sand, Amy treated him with the same care she had shown injured Sunward fighters. The second day brought the first real interaction. A Sunward warrior named Thexmar had been injured during the rush to the caves, and his wound was becoming infected. Amy was treating him when Shadow Speaker Neilwyn approached with a small pouch of medicinal herbs. "These will help with the infection," she said quietly, offering the herbs to Amy. Amy looked between the Shadowside leader and her Sunward patient. "Why are you helping him?" "Because infection kills," Neilwyn replied. "And death is death, regardless of which side suffers it." Thexmar looked up at the Shadowside leader with confusion. "Why would you help your enemy?" "Perhaps," Neilwyn said, slowly, "we have forgotten the difference between enemy and neighbor." As the storm continued to rage outside, more interactions began to develop. Tony Rodriguez organized work parties to maintain the shelter, and found that Sunward strength combined with Shadowside technical knowledge made certain tasks much easier. Ben Carter shared his cave maps with warriors from both sides, explaining how the underground water system connected to settlements across the entire region. The breakthrough came on the third day, when a section of the cave began to collapse due to the storm's vibrations. A young Shadowside female named Zara was trapped under falling rocks, and the tunnel that led to her location was too narrow for the large Sunward warriors to navigate. But Kexalon had the tools needed to dig her out, while the Shadowside team had the knowledge of how to support the unstable tunnel. For the first time in 50 years, Sunward and Shadowside Zarathi worked together on a common goal. Jake Morrison watched the rescue operation with growing amazement. The humans had done nothing but provide a neutral space and treat everyone equally. The Zarathi themselves were discovering that their supposed enemies were not so different from themselves. "How did you know this would happen?" Lisa asked quietly, as they watched Sunward and Shadowside working side by side to free the trapped girl. "I did not know," Jake admitted, "but I hoped. Sometimes people just need a chance to remember that they are all people." Dr. Amy Sullivan was treating minor injuries from the rescue when she made an observation that would change everything. No, the young ones work together naturally. It is only the older Zarathi who seem to have trouble cooperating." Shadow Speaker Neilwyn overheard the comment and nodded slowly. "The children born during this war have never known peace. But they also have never known the original reasons for fighting. To them, the conflict is just something that exists, not something that must exist." Solark Vextor had been watching the rescue operation with growing discomfort. His worldview was built on the idea that Sunward and Shadowside were natural enemies who could never coexist. But he was seeing his own warriors working effectively with Shadowside teams, and no one was dying or being betrayed. "This changes nothing," he declared, but his voice lacked conviction. "When the storm ends, we return to our settlements and our old ways." "Do we?" asked Elder Simtha. "Young Zara would be dead now if we had maintained our old ways." "How many others have died because we refused to work together?" The storm finally began to weaken on the fourth day. As the wind died down and the sand settled, both Zarathi factions prepared to leave the caves and return to their respective territories. But something fundamental had changed during their time together. Warrior Kexalon approached Jake Morrison before the Sunward group departed. "Human diplomat, what you have done here was not possible, yet it happened." "What we did was provide a safe space," Jake replied. "You did the rest yourselves." "But how did you know we would choose cooperation over conflict?" Jake smiled, looking tired but satisfied. "Because that is what people do when they are not afraid. Fear makes enemies. Safety allows neighbors. As both groups prepared to leave, Tony Rodriguez made one final announcement. The resource distribution plan is complete. The underground river system can support both settlements indefinitely if managed properly, but only if you continue to work together. The message from Zarian 7 reached the Galactic Council station like a thunderbolt. Commander Thexavar read the transmission 3 times before he could believe what it said. Both Zerathi factions were not only talking to each other, they were asking the human team to help them create a formal peace treaty. This must be some kind of mistake, Thexavar rumbled to his fellow council members. Or perhaps the humans are lying about their progress. Crystalline's crystal body chimed with confusion. Our sensors show that both Zerathi settlements have ceased all military activities. There have been no raids, no attacks, no violence for 7 days. Elder Menthkai leaned forward with interest. 7 days of peace on a world that has known 50 years of war. Even if the humans are exaggerating their role, something significant has occurred. On Zarion 7, the formal peace negotiations were taking place in the same cave system where the storm had forced the two sides together. But now the meetings were voluntary, and representatives from both factions arrived carrying proposals instead of weapons. Jake Morrison sat at a simple table made from salvaged materials with Solark Vextor on his right and Shadow Speaker Neilwyn on his left. It was the first time in decades that leaders from both sides had sat down together without intermediaries or neutral zones between them. The water distribution plan that your logistics specialist created is acceptable to both sides, Neilwyn announced, referring to Tony Rodriguez's detailed resource management proposal. But we need guarantees that both settlements will honor their commitments. Vexitor nodded slowly. The Sunward agreed to the plan, but we want assurance that the Shadow side will not use their technical knowledge to redirect water away from our territory. Dr. Amy Sullivan looked up from the medical reports she was reviewing. What if both sides shared technical knowledge instead of hoarding it? The Sunward have developed excellent water storage techniques for the hot climate. The Shadow side have created efficient purification systems for the underground rivers. Combined, both settlements could have better water security than either side alone. This suggestion sparked the first real discussion between the faction leaders. They began talking directly to each other, sharing information about their respective water management systems. Jake Morrison said nothing, allowing the conversation to develop naturally. Major Ben Carter spread his detailed cave maps across the table. There are at least 3 more underground river systems that neither side has found yet. But reaching them would require cooperation. The tunnels are too dangerous for small groups, and too complex for anyone who does not understand the geology. Cooperation. Vextor repeated the word like it was foreign to him. For 50 years, cooperation has meant weakness. For 50 years, you have been getting weaker, Lisa Parker observed. Both settlements have lost population. Both sides have fewer resources than when the war started. Both groups live in constant fear. How is that strength? The Shadow side. Elder Simtha spoke quietly. The young ones who worked together during the storm have been asking questions. They want to know why their cousins on the other side are enemies instead of neighbors. Cousins? Vexitor asked. We are the same species, Nilwen explained. Before the war, there were marriages between Sunward and Shadowside families. Some of the warriors you have been fighting are related to your own people. This revelation shocked Vextor. In 50 years of conflict, the personal connections between the two sides had been forgotten. The war had become so consuming that both sides had lost track of their shared history. Tony Rodriguez had been quietly taking notes throughout the discussion. Now he looked up with a practical question. If the fighting stops completely, what happens to all the warriors and military equipment? The warriors become workers, Amy suggested. Both settlements need people to manage the new water systems, to explore the additional underground rivers, to build better housing and infrastructure. And the weapons? Vextor asked. Tools, Ben replied. Most military equipment can be converted for construction and mining. Instead of destroying each other's settlements, you could be building new ones. The negotiations continued for 3 days. The human team said very little, mostly asking practical questions and offering technical solutions. The real work was being done by the Zarathi themselves, as they rediscovered their ability to communicate and compromise. The breakthrough came when young Zara, the Shadowside girl who had been rescued during the storm, arrived at the negotiations with a group of other young Zarathi from both sides. They had been working together since the storm ended, and they had a proposal of their own. "We want to build a new settlement," Zara announced, "in the Twilight Zone, where both sides can live together." The adult Zarathi leaders looked at the young people with surprise. The idea of a mixed settlement had never been considered. "It would be more efficient," explained Kexalon, who had become an unofficial leader among the younger generation. Sunward knowledge of heat management combined with Shadowside technical skills. Shared resources, shared defenses, shared everything. "And what about the old settlements?" Vexter asked. "Keep them," suggested another young Zarathi, "but as specialized centers. The Sunward settlement becomes the agriculture and manufacturing center. The Shadowside settlement becomes the research and education center. The new settlement becomes the trade and government center." Nilwen and Vextor exchanged glances. Their children were proposing a complete transformation of Zarathi society, turning their divided world into an integrated civilization. "This would require trust," Nilwen said carefully. "Trust has to start somewhere," Jake Morrison said, speaking for the first time in hours. "It might as well start with the people who will inherit this world." The final treaty was signed 5 days later. It established the shared water management system, created the framework for the new integrated settlement, and set up exchange programs between the existing communities. Most importantly, it included a provision that all major decisions affecting both sides would be made jointly. But the real celebration came when Dr. Amy Sullivan announced her final medical report. "There have been no conflict-related injuries for 12 days. No stress-related illnesses for 8 days. The overall health of both communities has improved significantly since the cooperation began. People are healthier when they are not trying to kill each other," Lisa observed. Who could have imagined? The Galactic Council received the final report from Zerion 7 with stunned disbelief. Not only had the humans achieved peace between the warring factions, but they had helped create a model for integration that was already being studied by other divided worlds. Commander Thexvar found himself in the uncomfortable position of having to admit that he had been completely wrong about human capabilities. "How did they succeed where we failed?" he asked during the Council's emergency session. Elder Menthkai had been studying the detailed reports from Zerion 7. "They succeeded because they did not try to impose a solution. They created conditions where the Zarathi could find their own solution." "But they are so weak," protested Susthera. "They nearly died multiple times during the mission." "Perhaps," Crystalline chimed thoughtfully, "we have been confusing weakness with vulnerability, and vulnerability with ineffectiveness." When the human team returned to the Galactic Council station, they looked exactly as weak and fragile as when they had left. Jake Morrison was thinner and more weathered. Amy Sullivan still showed signs of the illnesses that had plagued her throughout the mission. Ben Carter moved stiffly from his various injuries. Lisa Parker and Tony Rodriguez looked exhausted and worn down, but they had accomplished something that the galaxy's strongest species could not achieve. "How?" Thexvar asked bluntly when Jake stood before the council to deliver his final report. "How did your weak species succeed where our strength failed?" Jake looked around at the assembled alien representatives. "We succeeded because we understood something that you did not. Diplomacy is not about being stronger than the people you are trying to help. It is about being willing to be weak alongside them." "Weakness alongside strength?" Elder Menthkai asked, intrigued. "Shared vulnerability creates trust," Amy explained. "When people see that you can be hurt the same way they can be hurt, they know you understand their fears." "Shared struggle creates bonds," Ben added. "When people see you working just as hard as they are working, they know you care about the same things they care about." "And shared resources create community," Tony concluded. "When people see you willing to give up something for their benefit, They know you are committed to their success. Lisa Parker stepped forward. The other diplomatic. Missions failed because they tried to solve the Zarathi conflict from the outside. We succeeded because we became part of the conflict, and then helped everyone find a way out together. The Council voted unanimously to grant humanity full membership in the galactic community. But more than that, they established a new galactic diplomatic corps with humans in leadership positions. Dr. Amy Sullivan was appointed Director of Interspecies Conflict Resolution. Major Ben Carter became Chief of Unconventional Problem Solving. Lieutenant Commander Lisa Parker was named Head of Cultural Integration Programs. Staff Sergeant Tony Rodriguez took charge of resource management and logistics.